Hi, nutrition and wellness students. Welcome to our week 2 lesson on food and kind of an introduction to what food is from the perspective of nutritional science. I'm going to give you some advice up front here in this video, just for like general things to know about video lessons. First of all, I'm doing these instead of giving you a textbook to read from. In the past, teachers have, assigned a lot of reading instead of doing a lot of lessons. I've always preferred as a student lessons because it's a lot more interactive, even if I'm still just on a video screen. It's just more engaging to me than reading a textbook, and it's easier and quicker too. You may not feel that way, and if so, reach out and I'll give you some readings to do. But my understanding here is that you're actually going to watch all these videos, and if I notice that people aren't really watching them and the things I'm asking you to think about are not coming up in the assignments you're completing each week, then I'll have to assign some reading. So I am also kind of asking you to please watch the videos every week. They shouldn't be super long and they should be enjoyable. Speaking of length, my videos are pausable. So if you need to slow me down or stop me to write something down or to think about something, you can do it. That's an advantage of video lessons over live lessons, right? Another thing that's an advantage is this is on YouTube, and that means you can speed it up and slow it down by changing the speed control where the little gear is in the bottom right of the video, if you don't know how to do that. That means you can slow me down from going too fast. You can also speed me up if I'm not going fast enough. Sometimes I'll have professors who like really talk slowly, and I'll speed up their videos, and at 2x, it's like, oh, perfect. I'm going to get through this fast. And this is like exactly how fast I want to think about it. So you control my speed, you can pause me and start and stop me and so forth. All right, with that advice, let's launch right in. I want to start with a really important acknowledgement, which is that food is much more than just what nutritional science says about it. I'm not trying to prioritize the perspective of nutritional science over other perspectives on what food is. In fact, in some cases, it would be ridiculous to do so. In fact, let's go over this example here. This is an example of a first salmon ceremony from a Pacific Northwest tribe of indigenous people here in the United States. And this salmon has been sacrificed and offered, floating down the stream as a gift back to the river and a thank you to the salmon for coming back. It's a extraordinary tradition, and this salmon is about way more than its protein content, right? It'd be ridiculous of me to say that it's about its protein content. Same deal if I were to talk about the carbohydrate content of the bread at Mass. That is absolutely not the point of that bread, right? So I would never even in those contexts consider talking about nutritional science as a primary starting point for thinking about them. And other contexts, like there may be foods we talk about here that we're talking about the nutritional science of, and they may be actually personally meaningful to you. And I'll ask you to share that with me. And I'd love to hear more about like personally meaningful food traditions you might be engaged with. And if you're not, maybe you'll get to hear some from other people or hear about examples like this one. But I think we all have foods that are significant to us. I just want to point out that like the way we approach food is not just about nutritional science. That said, we are going to, of course, focus on a nutritional science perspective. And so I'm just going to bring up this image that you recognize from the walls of your room. Probably it's the wallpaper on your computer too. Certainly the most important image I could show you to start off this class, the periodic table, right? And we're not going to like focus a ton on this, so don't worry too much if you're like chemistry. What are we doing here? Well, we need to just think a little bit about some scientific background to get into what nutritional science says. So my introductory question for this lesson is this: what are the top 5 elements for growing food, and therefore the top 5 elements you'd find in food? So think about that. Pause the video for a second because I'm going to go on and the answer is going to show. So pause it and think about it. All right. I'm also going to make a habit at the beginning of each lecture video each week to give you a summary of what I'm going to talk about just really fast. Don't freak out that you don't know this yet. Of course you don't. It's just getting you to realize what we're going to talk about. Then I'm going to talk about it so you'll understand it better. Then at the end, I'll go over it again to make sure that you kind of feel like you got that information out of the lecture. So just be comfortable with the fact that you maybe don't know this yet, and it's going to seem foreign because we're about to learn about it. This is just to give you a preview. So first, I'm going to talk about what food is for. Food is for making more biomass. That means tissue of a living thing. So in my case, I'm made of human biomass that came from the biomass represented by my food, right? We also eat to get energy. And I think we're all kind of familiar with that. The specific type of energy we are eating to get is free energy. And you can think of it kind of like the opposite of entropy, if you studied that in your science classes. Entropy is disorder. So the universe is pretty disordered. This air around me in the room is just kind of a soup of different small molecules that are bouncing all around, pretty disordered. Whereas if you look at my body, it's very organized, right? And basically we say that the energy in our food is the energy we're using to keep ourselves organized like this. The technical term for that is free energy. Okay. Second thing we're going to address in this lecture is, what is food made of? Food is made of mainly 5 elements. There they are. If you got even 4 or 3 or 2, like great. If you got all 5, very well done. It's not easy to get all 5. So I say life is fonky because it's made of phonc, P-H-O-N-C, phosphorus, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. Plus it's made of other micronutrients, so we're going to think more about that in a minute. Keep in mind that the elements that food and therefore living things are made of, they really all, at the beginning of the food chain, they come from photosynthesis. At some point, some plant did that process and harvested carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen together with sunlight and started making biomass, right? And then it got eaten by me if it was a salad, or maybe it got eaten by a cow and then got eaten by me as a steak, right? So that's where I'm getting my carbon, my hydrogen, my oxygen, and then the phosphorus and nitrogen that might be in my steak or in my salad, those are coming from the soil. So we tend to call those fertilizer, alongside a whole array of what are called micronutrients. And we're going to get into detail on all of these, so don't worry. Now, in more detail about where those are located in my food, if I'm eating something that's like very fatty, the fats themselves are made of pretty much carbon and hydrogen. If I'm eating something that's carbohydrate rich, carbohydrates are made of C, H, and O. Proteins made of the 4 that spell honk if you rearrange them. So they have some nitrogen in them. And then the nucleic acids, or as I'm calling them here, NAs, those include DNA and RNA that you probably learned about in biology. Those are made of all 5. And then vitamins and minerals in your diet, those might have the 5 elements that I've mentioned and other elements too. The nutritive content of food is also going to vary based on other things than just its elemental makeup, right? So it's not just which of those 5 plus some micronutrients are in your food, although that's part of it. It's also like, what type of organism are you actually eating? And therefore, which mixture of specific molecules does that organism arrange its phonc to make? Because different molecules might be made of, like C and H and B fats. But as you probably already know, not all fats are equivalent. You've probably heard about trans fat being kind of bad. Maybe saturated fat doesn't sound like the best thing to you, whereas maybe you've heard of omega-3 fat being like a good thing. And those are all pretty good starting points for understanding fat. So those are all made of C and H. They're all hydrocarbons. They're all made of the same elements, but they're arranged in different ways. And depending on what type of organism you eat, they're going to have a different balance of those different arrangements. In chemistry, we just call an arrangement of atoms a molecule. And in a living thing, we call it a biomolecule. So that's going to affect the nutritive content of your food. And then finally, the amount of processing and the distance it's traveled to get to you. And that's basically because, sure, an organism builds itself out of these 5 elements plus some micronutrients. But if it has to travel a long distance, those molecules it's arranged into are going to change over time as the organism ripens or becomes, decays a little bit, or just even sits and isn't alive, isn't dynamically alive the way it was when it was originally harvested. So we'll talk more about all of these things. Okay, back to the question. We've now answered it, and I'm going to show you a little bit more here. So the way I think about nutrition as a starting point is the molecules you're eating are basically made of the things I've circled in green there. You'll notice I've also added in sulfur, which would be a good, like, kind of 6th place answer, alongside calcium, which some organisms have a lot of calcium. So if you said either of those, sulfur or calcium, good job. That's a good extra answer. So these are arranged into the molecules you see up here on the left, and I've just taken you through those in the previous slide. Fat is basically made of C and H, carbon and hydrogen. Carbohydrates, CHO. Proteins, a little bit of sulfur, as well as honk, and nucleic acids, all 5. Okay. I've also circled a few, not all of the ones I could have, but a few other necessary elements to get you thinking about things that might be considered micronutrients, right? So these would be things that we need less of, like you need a little bit of selenium. Actually, too much selenium would be really bad for you, but a little bit is necessary. If you had absolutely zero selenium, you would not survive. So a little bit is needed, a little bit of zinc, a little bit of iron, a little bit more iron maybe than selenium anyway. So these are things you need some of, but not too much. We call them micronutrients, right? The part that I blocked off in red, and it also would include this little corner here, those are basically things that you wouldn't want to be exposed to in any appreciable amount, right? Like if you've got lead in your drinking water, you're being poisoned, right? You definitely don't want to consume these different elements. A lot of them are radioactive. A lot of them are directly toxic, like they would say acutely toxic. They'll kill you if you consume them. And others might be like cause chronic problems if you're constantly exposed to them, such as my example of lead in water. So this is kind of a relief, I think, in thinking about nutrition, because we're not really thinking about very much of the periodic table. In chemistry class, if you studied like this stuff down here, it's kind of complicated, right? And luckily, we don't have to think about that very much. We're just basically thinking about how are these elements in green moving around and becoming part of our food and getting arranged in a way that has a certain impact on us when we eat it. And then, what's the content of these other micronutrients, which we need some of, but not too much of. Okay, so that's how we're approaching this class at the start here. I want to give you an example just so you can think about this a little bit. And again, if some of you aren't super into chemistry, no problem, but you just look at the images here so you can see the point. Obviously, you don't need to remember any of the detail. These are an example of 9 different amino acids that make up proteins. There's about 20 that are used in our proteins. Notice what they're made of, right? So just start looking at the symbols. I just want to show you, like, yes, indeed, honk, just like we said. And you're like, didn't you say honk plus a little bit of sulfur in a protein? Yes, and that would be our friend methionine here that has one little sulfur atom tucked right in here, right? So sulfur is kind of like, you need a little bit of it if you're a plant, so you can make a couple extra things and pass them on to animals that might be eating you, if they do indeed eat you. So mostly we've just got carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And this is also to show you what I mean by they're arranged in different ways. Now, again, luckily, you don't need to recognize any of these. If you decide to become a biochemistry major in college, you will learn to remember them. And that may seem scary at first. And then once you start to learn the patterns, it's not as hard as you might think, right? But at any rate, these are just to show you that it's those same elements over and over again, arranged different ways that provide the basis for the food that we're eating. And if we think about what the balance of these different elements and of these different arrangements of them is in our food, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the nutritional content of our food. How many, of the carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, nitrogens are arranged to make leucine? What's the leucine content? And is it balanced with some other amino acids that we might need in order to make our own proteins to get, muscular and so forth? Okay. Now, I also mentioned to you that I've reviewed photosynthesis. Okay, so now that you know that this is kind of what our food's made of, and these elements that we're thinking about, FONC, are arranged in a certain way to make a range of molecules that we eat, right, to make more of ourselves and to acquire energy. Here is a quick refresher, right, because I'm sure you remember this equation. If you don't have this one memorized, I recommend you do just for general life knowledge. It's good to know what the photosynthesis equation is. Carbon dioxide and water are taken in by a plant or a different type of photosynthetic organism. Could be like algae in the ocean, or could be, phytoplankton in the ocean, for example. At any rate, carbon dioxide and water are taken in. Light energy is used to rearrange them into a much larger molecule called glucose, which is CHNO. Go back in the lecture, you'll notice that's a classic carbohydrate, right? CHO. And glucose is indeed one of the simpler carbohydrates. And the byproduct of that, of course, is oxygen, for which we are thankful because we breathe that to help break down our food. So you could also write it in words like this, and that would be just fine. If you don't love chemistry, don't worry about writing the formulas. Just know carbon dioxide and water are put together to make glucose with a byproduct of oxygen in the presence of light. And that's kind of the key. Now, why do I show this to you? First of all, you should think about the fact that every bit of energy in my body and your body right now pretty much came from this process. So we are sunlight energy walking around, right? And as long as we keep eating, we're getting sunlight energy. And no matter what you're eating, if you're eating a fish that ate algae, the algae did this, right? If you're eating a cow that ate grass, the grass did this. And that's where the cow got its energy, and that's where you got the energy from the cow. So we are at heart light energy. That is how we stay organized. That's what drives Earth to have living systems on it. And that's a huge part of the basis of our food. Also, the carbon in your body, the hydrogen in your body, the oxygen in your body, a good bit of it, really the carbon especially primarily comes from this, right? This is the process that makes that carbon into a form that is an actual food molecule. It's an actual biological molecule. You cannot breathe in CO2 and expect to build more human out of it, right? But you can definitely eat glucose and expect to build more of yourself using that and other molecules in your food. The plant, by the way, takes the glucose it makes and it uses the glucose to make all the other stuff, right? So it'll take its glucose and modify it to make other biological molecules. If it wants to make a fat, for example, fats are CNH, it just subtracts the oxygen basically and turns it into just CNH. And now it has a fat, right? So this is the starting point for pretty much all of the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that we are made of, especially the carbon. Now, you might be thinking, I thought we're made of FONC, so where does the P and the N come from? Well, I'm glad you asked. So phosphorus and nitrogen are basically fertilizer, and I've put a couple of images in here. So if you've got a plant that has any amount of protein in it, and all plants have a little bit, but if you've got one that's kind of protein rich, it probably needs a lot of fertilizer to grow. For example, corn actually has a decent bit of protein in it. And in order to grow, corn does need a lot of fertilizer. It's really fertilizer intensive. And what do we mean by fertilizer? We mean this, nitrogen and phosphorus. Shouldn't be a surprise. What I want you to see in this lecture is, oh, that actually kind of makes sense because, you know, FONC is life. Photosynthesis takes care of CH and O. Where do the P and the N come from? Fertilizer, right? Now, naturally, right, without using chemicals like fertilizer, where would they come from is a fair question. And one of the biggest places they come from is these bacteria that live in the soil and in the roots of certain plants. They can actually take nitrogen right out of the air and turn it into protein and other compounds that are usable in living tissues to make more biomass of organisms. Pretty epic, right? So what humans are doing with fertilizer is we're basically speeding that process up. We're saying, I don't want to wait for some bacteria to like help me grow a ton of corn. I'm just going to use my superpowers of being a smart human to make a bunch of fertilizer to dump on the field. Now, if you study environmental science, which is the other class I teach, you'd learn about a lot of problems that go along with that. So I don't want to lie and say that's no problem, but it does help you to grow a lot of corn for sure. Naturally speaking, the plants that have these bacteria in the greatest abundance in their root systems are called legumes. So if any of you are vegetarians, you might know that beans and nuts are a really good source of protein for a vegetarian. They both come from legumes. That's why legumes have so much protein, because protein requires nitrogen, and the legumes have these wonderful bacteria helping them to get it. So all these things do connect, and it's kind of neat to learn about these nutritional stories and to understand what's actually in your food. Okay, so to summarize at this point, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen coming from photosynthesis, along with energy, right, that's harvested from the sunlight, and nitrogen and phosphorus, as well as some other micronutrients from the soil into your food. You eat it, it becomes part of your biological molecules that you're made of, right, and part of the energy that supports your system. Now, another important factor to consider as we're thinking about what is food actually made of, right, it's important to consider where it's coming from and how it's grown, right? Like how long does it take to get to you, and you know, what are the practices that have been used to grow it? So I'm going to tell a quick story about myself. So before I lived in California, which is where I live now, as you heard in my introduction, I lived in Hawaii for 8 years. And it was a really wonderful place to live. And if any of you have a connection to Hawaii, I would love to, you know, exchange messages about that, talk to you on Zoom about that. I really loved my time there. One of my favorite things food related in Hawaii is when mangoes are in season. Friends, if you've not had a fresh mango in the tropics where they grow, you have not had a mango. And for those of you who have had it, you're nodding and going, that's correct. And for those of you who hadn't, you're like, oh boy, I got to get one of these, I think. So mangoes, when they are harvested fresh from a tree, and they would typically be in season in Hawaii in like the late spring. So, I'd go in to teach my classes and I'd have colleagues who had mango trees in their yard, and you can see how many mangoes this tree is producing. Those are not grapes, right? Those are like big, like they'll fit in your hand like this size. And so a tree that is full of them has enormous quantities. So typically people would just bring in a whole like plastic shopping bag just loaded with them because they're just too many for them to eat. They'll rot within a couple of days, right? And that's actually kind of a key thing. So you got to eat them pretty much when they're ready. They ripen on the tree, they're ready, and in a couple of days they're on the ground rotten. So you got to pick them and eat them, and people will give them away to you if they have them, right? So that when that mango is fresh off the tree like that, the nutrient content in there and the flavor content that goes with it is exceptional. It's absolutely delicious, and it is incredibly rich in all kinds of vitamins. B vitamins would be one huge component that's just absolutely loaded up in the mango. Now, if you buy a mango here in California or in a lot of places across the US mainland, especially one that's kind of out of season, or just, one that's like far north, especially, most places in the US, you're not going to have mangoes that are fresh anywhere nearby. So what's happening there is they're being harvested earlier, right? Because if you harvest them when they're ripe, you're not going to be able to get them to the supermarket before they rot, right? So that's not going to be very efficient or very effective at all. So you'll harvest them early. You'll let them kind of sort of ripen on the ride to the supermarket, which takes, days to maybe even weeks. You'll time it so that they arrive and they're kind of just beginning to get ripe, but they're not ripening on the tree, which means the dynamicism of the biological organism that is a mango tree is not going on, and the nutrient content, the way those biological molecules, the way FONC and the micronutrients, the vitamins and the minerals are being arranged in that mango is not happening the same, because the mango is now sitting in the hold of a boat or in the back of a truck or on a supermarket shelf, which is not where it actually ripens properly. So the nutrient content is different, right? And when you eat it, it's not nearly as delicious as a result. So consider those factors as well. How long has it come from to get to you? And what kinds of agricultural practices are used? If it's someone's backyard tree, guaranteed it's not being like doused in pesticide or artificially fertilized for the most part, right? Whereas if it's grown on a giant, huge scale industrial operation that's growing thousands and thousands and thousands and millions of these, then it's not going to be grown with the same kind of practices, and that also affects the nutritional content. Also, try a mango in the tropics if you ever get a chance. Okay, so summary of the lecture here. The reasons we eat are to build more biomass. Our biomass is made of FONC and some micronutrients, as you saw. The source of the C, H, and O in FONC is photosynthesis. The source of the phosphorus and nitrogen is the soil, whether from natural organisms like bacteria that can get it for us, or from things like fertilizer that we add. And then micronutrients, which are also in the soil. Fats are the form that carbon and hydrogen alone compose. And there are a bunch of different forms of fat. We're going to learn some details on them next week. The week after that, we're going to go into more detail on carbs, which are made of CH and O together. Proteins will be the week after that, and then nucleic acids, vitamins, and minerals will kind of all put together in the next week after that. Now, the additional thing that we eat for is to get free energy, that energy that organizes ourselves and keeps our systems running, and that free energy flows through photosynthesis up food chains to us, and originally it comes from the sun, which is pretty awesome to think about, that you are sunlight energy walking around. Finally, the nutritive content of food is not just influenced by the presence of like those 5 elements in certain arrangements. You have to take a step back and think, what kind of organism am I eating? What did it make itself out of? How did it arrange to make its unique self? How did it arrange the FONC and the micronutrients in its living tissues? And then how was it grown, and how was it processed, and how far did it travel? That mango that I ate in Hawaii, or the many mangoes that I ate there, were not processed. Like literally, you just have someone get out a knife, slice it open, cut it in half, and you'd scoop it out with a spoon and eat it. So zero processing. And processing alters chemistry. So processing means the nutritional content changes. If you're wondering what I mean by processed, I mean, if you go to the middle of a grocery store and there's all stuff in boxes that has weird sounding ingredients on it, like xanthan gum, those are processed foods. They've been chemically and physically processed to change their flavor, to change their texture, and it changes their nutritional content too. All right, finally, I'm going to introduce you to the activity for this week. The activity for this week has to do with nutritional labeling. And I'm asking you to think through a little bit about nutritional content of foods that you commonly eat. You'll see the details in the PDF that's posted in the assignment. I do just want to tell you a bit about what's on a nutritional label and show you what I've just said to you in context. So check this out. If you look at a nutritional label, the first thing you want to look at, I know we're often drawn down to like the actual stuff that's in there. Always, 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 it's important to consider, and this comes directly from the CDC's webpage, actually. They recommend, as would I, always look at the serving size first. I went to buy yogurt for my 7-month-old daughter recently, okay? And this tiny little yogurt, it's like it's for baby, right? It's like baby yogurt, tiny little yogurt, like a few spoonfuls if one of us were to eat it. And I look on the back and I'm like, oh gosh, there's like 17 grams of sugar. That's a little heavy, but I guess it's a full thing of yogurt. Should have followed my own advice. Thankfully, before I bought it, look up at the serving size. Oh, there are 3 servings in this. So technically there's 3 times that 17 grams of sugar or 51 grams of sugar in this little yogurt, and I put it back on the shelf. So be careful with that. Oftentimes if a food manufacturer knows there's something you might not like, they may try to hide it by reducing the serving size and just saying, you know, there's a lot of servings in the container. Now, also keep in mind, you know, if you look and you're like, oh, I would eat this in one sitting, and then you realize they're saying it's 8 servings, that tells you the same thing. So those are the top 2 things to look at. After you've got a chance to look at that, then you can start thinking about what's actually there. Notice like these are the things we talked about. So fat as well as cholesterol, those all belong to the same category of food, which is broadly called lipids. That's the technical term for fats, oils, cholesterol, and a handful of other C and H based molecules, right? This is going to tell us how much total fat is there, how much of it is saturated fat, how much of it is trans fat. Some labels will add monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. We'll learn more details about those next week, like I said. For now, don't worry too much about it. Sodium, that's Na. That's one of the kind of micronutrients. And if you're thinking, I eat kind of a lot of salt, yeah, it should be a micronutrient. It's very tasty, and so we eat too much of it, but it should be something we have a little bit of, not a lot, right? Total carbohydrates, so there's CHO-based molecules, and you can see fiber and sugar, and maybe you see starches. And there's also this new thing where they show you the amount of added sugar. So some sugars are just kind of naturally occurring in the food stuff. Sometimes you're actually talking about like processed sugar that's been added in. There is a distinction there, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about carbohydrates. At the bottom, protein. So you basically got all 4 except for nucleic acids, so really 3, but you know, nucleic acids we'll talk a bit about in that final week of this unit, and you'll hear about why they might not be on the label. So basically that's what they're telling you. FONC plus the micronutrients. The micronutrients are mostly arrayed at the bottom, as you see. So like vitamin D, calcium, iron, potassium, those are all examples of micronutrients. So I'm asking you in the assignment, and again, read the PDF to get the details on it, to pick 3 different foods that you encounter in your life across 3 different categories. So read the PDF and make sure you're selecting from the different categories, and to actually talk about their nutritional content using what you've learned this week and using a close reading of the nutritional label. And if there's no label, I've posted a link where you can look up the nutritional content, and you can basically improvise your own you know, label. I don't need you to make it designed carefully or anything like that. Don't spend an inordinate amount of time, but you can basically tell me what kind of nutritional content is in that food, okay? And reach out to me if you have any trouble with any of the assignments, including this week's assignment. The final thing I'll conclude with is I'll always mention a book of the week in that week's video lesson. So this week, my book of the week is going to be The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan. What he points out is like one of our fundamental issues, right, as a species, is that we actually have to pick what to eat. And, you know, he kind of mentions like, if you're a panda, like you don't have to answer that question. Like bamboo is what's for food, right? That's what you eat. That's it. So that's actually kind of an interesting starting point. So other species, you know, don't have Sophie Connect classes and things, and don't have classes at all, to my knowledge. But they, even if they're omnivores, they don't get to like think through what the nutritional content of their food is. We actually do, and we actually have like a lot of different stuff we could eat, some of which is better for us than others, and a good balance of which is important. So like what you're studying in this class kind of is a big deal. It's like might be the big deal. In fact, some scientists have suggested that like a explanation for why we have big brains might be in part because we have to manage our diet, like, and have to kind of remember what we can and cannot eat, what we should and should not eat, especially in a natural setting where some things are poisonous and other things are good for us. So it's an interesting starting point. If you're interested in the book, certainly encourage you to pick it up, pick up a copy of the library and read a few pages and put it back if you don't like it, or end up reading the whole thing if you're into it. Okay, so yeah, reminder that food is a really significant thing for more reasons than just nutrition. I hope you didn't find this like boring or dry. Come to office hours if you're like, this is too much for me, I don't get this chemistry stuff. We can talk through it. I'm here to support you. I want to help you. Reach out to me. Don't even worry about office hours. Just say, hey, can we meet? And we'll find a time to make it work. I'm here to support you. I think this is really important to learn about. I also want to hear about genuinely like what food means to you outside of nutrition. So I'm ending here with a pot of Italian tomato sauce, homemade Italian tomato sauce. When I see a pot of tomato sauce like this, I just think of growing up with a mom who was of Italian ancestry, who would make sauce like this. That was her grandfather's recipe, that has been passed down through her family, that I now have. And it's just much more meaningful than just the nutritional content, though it is also good for you and delicious. So I ask you to reflect a little bit on what kind of food fits that bill in your life, and consider including that in your work for this week, your assignment. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this first lesson, and I'm looking forward to many more, and I'm looking forward to reading your first assignment. Again, reach out if you have any questions. I'm always here for you.